For decades, the history of the DC Universe has been marked by its crisis-level events, status quo-altering storylines that have rewritten continuity while also providing a meta-commentary on DC Comics publishing itself, and all under a signature red glow. This is Red Skies, a 13-part podcast epic mining these events and the Superman of it all. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Red Skies Chapter 5, and joining me to discuss the road to Infinite Crisis is returning guest, Scott Honig. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm always thrilled to be here and to talk about some really fun comics.
Yes, this is a pretty interesting stretch of comics that we'll be looking at, the lead up to Infinite Crisis, which I think for a lot of fans was perhaps more exciting, more enjoyable than Infinite Crisis itself. I tend to get that sense in hearing from people, and that's one of the things we'll talk about. The feeling as this was coming out, that excitement, whether or not we ultimately feel it was paid off in what followed, how the work holds up almost 20 years later, divorced from the event itself, really just looking at these various miniseries and one-shots on their own. So I'm excited to unpack all of that with you. Let me ask you, though, just a personal big picture question. As far as these crisis events generally, right, and over the course of this event, we're looking at all of them. Where do you land on these? Do you tend to enjoy these big crisis level events? What's your experience been with them generally?
I think mileage varies event to event, and a lot of it depends on what age I was when I read it for the first time, where in my life I was. So these miniseries and the lead up to Infinite Crisis was all at a time when I was relatively new to the wider DC universe. I'd started in the early 2000s with Superman and a little bit of Flash, but this was the first time where I was really seeing the DC universe unfolding writ large. All corners of the universe being explored, outer space, the magical corner, the villain side, all of it. And so it was exciting. It was exciting because I was in my young 20s. I think I either just had my first child, she was a baby, or I might have been childless at this point. And so it was just like a fun time to explore a universe that I just didn't know that well. So I was very, very excited to experience all of it, new characters and new concepts, and some of them held up well and some of them didn't. But I like the idea of a crisis event. I think sometimes more than I like the execution. I guess it depends on what DC editorial's motivations were for putting forth the event. If it was to usher in a new phase of storytelling for the entire line, whether it was to clean things up, as I know you explored with the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, or whether it was just to, a showcase for some characters or to kill some of them off, or, whatever the point was. I think that determines the overall success and my overall enjoyment of the event. But for the most part, I think I'm always excited when there's a sort of line-wide crossover, the opportunity to get to see characters you don't often see interact with each other. Usually the stakes are higher than they are in the regular course of storytelling over, a month-to-month schedule. So yeah, I mean, in general, I think I'm a fan of more than I'm not.
Gotcha. No, that all makes sense. I agree totally about the motivation, right? The ultimate motivation, always sell books and make money. But
Sell books, make money.
But beyond that, no, I think you're spot on. When we're dealing with events that seem manufactured more so to achieve a result continuity-wise, for example, you can still have fun with it, but maybe there's a little less meat on the bone there. Whereas if you have something that is hopefully more character-driven, or like you said, that's meant to usher in kind of a new phase of storytelling, I think, there are obviously different ways that this can shake out depending on the event and who's involved and all of that. This is an interesting period because this was, and we'll talk more about this next week when we do Infinite Crisis itself, but an event designed to be a true sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths on its 20th anniversary. And so you have all of that swirling around. Again, I'll be keeping this in mind as I do my Infinite Crisis reread and when we have that discussion. But at least my memory of Infinite Crisis and my impression of it, I know there were continuity changes that came out of it. For me, the one that always jumps out is the reinstating Clark's past as Superboy, which had been jettisoned post-Crisis, and now this is once again part of his history. But at the same time, I never got the sense that was the main thrust, the main reason for doing that story. It was more to have a big Crisis event, a sequel to the original one on the 20th anniversary. So that was always kind of been my impression.
And if I recall, was this the event that expanded the multiverse back into a multiverse?
Yeah, so it's funny because my memory was that the return of the multiverse was Infinite Crisis itself, and then I was doing the first episode of this event with Dan Greenfield. He was like, no, like that happens in 52, the actual rebirth of the multiverse. We get the formation of New Earth at the end of Infinite Crisis. So, hey, speaking of 52, you're going to be back in 2 weeks for a discussion of that 52 weekly series. And this might surprise the audience. I've never read it. So this is going to be my first time making my way through 52. I had started it when it first came out and I just kind of fell off. So I'm excited to finally read it after all these years.
If my memory holds up as well as I hope it does, I think you're really going to enjoy it. I loved it when it was first coming out, but it's a chore. I mean, it's, a weekly comic for a year is not easy to keep up with, but I remember really liking it. I'm looking forward to getting a chance to now sort of binge the whole thing. I think it'll be a different experience and hopefully a better experience even than the first time around.
Now, if I were smart, I would pace out the reading of that, right? And take my time with it. I don't have the time to read it weekly, but to still sort of make a little bit more of a meal out of it and not try to binge it yet. Knowing myself, I'm sure it will be a few days before, and I'm like 52 issues, here we go. And then I'm going to come into the episode. I'm like, Scott, this was so dense. There was so much. But no, it'll be fun. I'm looking forward to it. So
me too. As
far as what we read for this one, and for people who know this era, you can probably rattle off the list before I even get to it. But we started, of course, with the Countdown to Infinite Crisis special, written by Jeff Johns, Judd Winnick, and Greg Rucka. Then, of course, we have those 4 6-issue lead-in miniseries. Day of Vengeance by Bill Willingham and Justiniano. Villains United by Gail Simone and Dale Eaglesham. RANN-THANAGAR WAR by Dave Gibbons and Ivan Rice. And the OMAC Project by Greg Rucka and Jesus Saiz. And in the middle of the OMAC Project, we had the spin-off crossover Sacrifice, which spanned the 3 Superman titles at the time, Superman Action and Adventure, as well as Rucka's Wonder Woman series. And though I didn't assign this, I did also take a look at the first arc of JSA Classified, written by Jeff Johns and drawn by Amanda Connor and Jimmy Palmiotti, that dealt with Power Girl's convoluted origin story and involved Psycho Pirate, and helped set the stage, like all of these others, for Infinite Crisis. In our Identity Crisis episode, we discussed Crisis of Conscience. So between that episode and of course, Identity Crisis itself, so between these 2 episodes, I think we've hit the vast, vast majority of the material leading into Infinite Crisis. We were talking off mic. One of the ones we didn't do was the DC special Return of Donna Troy miniseries. For any fans of that, I'm sorry, we're skipping that one. I was saying to you off mic, I was like, we have Power Girl and her convoluted origin story. And I was like, that's about as much as I care. I can't really bring myself to do yet another one. But it's a fair amount of material that we looked at, and I think it'll give us plenty to talk about.
I think so. Yeah, and I think you're right to draw a line somewhere, because it's at a certain point, the impact on the main event is so minimal that it probably wasn't worth it to check it out anyway. Not for this purpose, I wouldn't tell somebody if they're into Donna Troy not to check it out, but for this, it didn't make sense.
Yes. And look, this was the period of time, for better or worse, and I would say, especially in retrospect, probably worse. It's one thing to have these miniseries, but Identity Crisis and Infinite Crisis, those events spilled over into a lot of books. And in our Identity Crisis episode, we talked about some tie-ins to that story that I thought worked great. Like there was an issue of JSA where you got to see Dr. Midnight perform the autopsy. And it was like, oh, this was a great tie-in, and it was really interesting. as we continue to move forward, and especially as we get closer to Infinite Crisis, my my memory of this from the time, and especially what little I have reread now, especially on the Superman side, it was more disruptive. It felt like more table setting, and it's one of those things where now when you go back and you read, for example, as we did, the Greg Rucka run on Adventures of Superman starts off great, and then towards the end, it's dealing with a lot of this Infinite Crisis business, and so again, especially years removed, looking back on it, I don't know how much that helps the run, but at the time, look, all the books were moving towards it. It was an all hands on deck sort of thing, and I can appreciate that.
Well, you're to that point though, it all goes back to, why are we rereading this? I mean, obviously taking it out of the context of 2005 and 6 when all this was coming out, reading it now, as you said, almost 20 years later, if your intention is, I want to see how Greg Rucka's run kind of pans out, yeah, by the time you get towards the end, you're going to be a little disappointed because whatever momentum he's building for his own story kind of gets curtailed because it has to dovetail into the main event. So when we were reading it for that purpose, you're right, it didn't feel as satisfying. But now coming back and seeing those issues that at that point were disruptive, but now are leading us directly towards Infinite Crisis, which is the purpose of these discussions for the next couple of weeks for you, they make a lot more sense. And I find that they're a lot more relevant and a lot more entertaining because our mindset has changed in terms of how we're approaching them, like what our purpose is, what the intention for the discussions are. So reading Sacrifice here outside of a discussion of Greg Rucka's run is a much more satisfying experience than it was having to kind of put those issues into the sequence of his art.
No, very, very much so. And that's why it has been interesting over the course of this podcast. There are certain eras, runs, issues, arcs where we've hit them a couple of times from a couple of different perspectives. And it is always interesting to see exactly where they fit in. That context is always such a huge piece of all of this. So again, when we talk about this lead up to Infinite Crisis, and it's funny, when I was first mapping out this event, I had all of this as one episode. Again, in the early mapping. And then I very quickly was like, what are you doing? You got to separate this out because Infinite Crisis itself, there's a ton going on. And we do also have those other specials and there's various tie-ins, but even just those 7 issues in and of themselves, there's a lot to work through there. And this buildup, this really was a moment for DC fans. And, not unlike yourself, this was the first real Crisis event that I was there for. And we've been talking about this in these episodes. Like I was just a little too young when 0 Hour first hit. I came to it later, but I certainly wasn't reading that main miniseries as it was coming out. I was reading the Superman issues that tied into it, and I was so confused when those pages went to white at the end. And even something like Identity Crisis, I was there for that. And we talked last week about how it does earn its Crisis title, but it's still not the kind of Crisis that we're talking about when we talk about the original one, when we talk about Infinite Crisis. So this was a first for me. And, for anyone who wasn't reading the books at the time, I can't stress how exciting this all was. And I was doing a little bit of research. So that special that we're starting with here, the Countdown special, that was originally solicited as DC Countdown. The full title was not revealed in the solicitation, and it came out at the end of March 2005. And what I was trying to get a sense of, and I didn't get a definitive answer, but I got at least a little bit of clarity. My memory of it was that we didn't know the full title until it hit stands. And certainly my memory, unless I just totally off here, I remember being surprised when I saw the true title and what this was actually building towards, what it was actually counting down to. Someone sent me an IGN article that was breaking down a lot of the history of this, and the article was posted the week before this book came out, and it talked about the full title. So, and again, audience, if you can shed a little bit more light on this, or Scott, if you happen to know, please share. But again, my understanding of it, for the most part, this was a surprise when the book came out as far as the true title. It seems like within the comics community, and it's one of those things I have to imagine word had gotten out in some way, shape, or form, but especially if you were really dialed into this. But for at least some fans, I mean, myself included, seeing that book and seeing what the true title was, like that was the moment. What memory if any, do you have of that?
I wish I had more, to be honest with you. I'm listening to you talk, and I'm trying to recall, and I don't really remember. I mean, I remember being surprised by the contents of the issue, which I know we'll talk about, but I don't remember. I remember being excited about the release of it. I remember thinking this feels big. This feels like it's a lead into something. As far as the exact reveal of the title, that I don't remember. But I will say, you know, if we're thinking back to the middle of 2005, the internet was around, but it wasn't quite what it is today in terms of social media and, and all that. Now it's virtually impossible to keep something like this a secret. I mean, it is in the solicitations. Usually, these things are spoiled, partially or entirely before they're even in out. And so it makes it harder to build the anticipation for it. I remember knowing very little about what was happening in DC, but I can't remember whether that was because there just wasn't as much publicized, or because me being relatively new to DC, I wasn't looking in the right places, or I didn't know what things meant. I was sort of learning along the way. So I wish I had a better sense of it, but I don't. I just remember being generally excited. In a way, I mean, I was excited for Identity Crisis too, but then having read it, the scope of it is, as you said, much smaller than it is for most of the other all the other Crisis events. So this one just felt bigger. And I believe in the lead into Infinite Crisis was the first year of New York Comic Con too. So, like around 2006, I believe. So I just remember leading up to, and then particularly coming out of it, there was the excitement that was drummed up because I live here and was able to attend that con, and Dan DiDio was doing, DC Nation panels and things like that, and they were dropping all sorts of hints. And so that felt really exciting, but I just don't recall the specifics
No, that's
about it.
totally fine. I mean, again, I was able to confirm that original solicitation, so they did hide the ball as far as what the title was, and then as far as when the word actually got out, I'm sure it was a mix. I'm sure there were some who had figured it out or found out ahead
Yeah.
of time, and others like myself who were genuinely surprised when I saw it on New Comic Book Day. But to whatever extent, even just in terms of the solicitation, to the extent that they made this a surprise, I think is fantastic. I do agree. I think these days it's next to impossible, and it's one of those things where either the publisher spoils it themselves and controls the message and tries to get some publicity out of it, or it gets spoiled for. So, but
Right.
in any event, yeah, this was almost 20 years ago. So it was a really, really exciting time. This special came out at the end of March 2005. Then we had the 6 months of the lead-in miniseries from April through September, and then Infinite Crisis #1 dropped in October 2005. For me personally, this was the end of my senior year of high school into my freshman year of college. So, a very formative, pivotal time in terms of my comic book reading and collecting. And I've talked about this a lot, including our last episode. I don't mean to be a broken record, but this was really the height of, I don't want to say of my fandom, because honestly, over the course of doing this podcast, I feel like it's reached a whole new level, a whole new dimension. But certainly at the time, especially as far as me being dialed in to what was happening and chomping at the bit for the next issue and the size of my pull list, like all of those things, this really was the height. There were very few DC books I wasn't getting at the time. I mean, I was all in on this. I cannot stress this enough. And I was working at my local comic shop, and especially over that time, the summer before college, it was just a really, really exciting time personally and as a comic fan. And so I was really all in on this, the special and then the miniseries that followed. I was trying to remember. Maybe I reread all of this stuff once, either right before, during, or right after Infinite Crisis, but I've not gone, if I even did that, and I certainly haven't gone back to it since that time. So it's been a long while since I looked at this countdown special and all of these lead-in miniseries. So we'll talk more specifically, obviously, but just generally speaking, how did these hold up for you?
So it's very hard to answer that question putting them all in one bucket
That's
because
fair. That's fair.
the four miniseries are so different from one another. I agree with you in the sense that each one felt like it was building out a corner of the DC universe, particularly for me, corners that I hadn't really explored. I mean, if it wasn't sort of mainstream JLA and Teen Titans stuff, I really wasn't. I wasn't familiar. So that was exciting. But each one kind of hit me in a different way. And as we sort of break them down, I'll let you know how I responded to each one originally and then how I responded to it now. I will say for the most part, I really did enjoy rereading them. I had not reread them since they originally came out. I had since gotten rid of all my single issues, and for whatever reason, I only bought two of the four miniseries in trade. I had gotten the RANN-THANAGAR War and Villains United. Those were the two that I got, and I'm trying to remember why, why those two and not the others, and I really can't remember. So I ordered the two other trades and got to experience all of it, which was a ton of fun. It was really a ton of fun. I wish I knew why I didn't order the other two. Maybe I just didn't. I think I just didn't like them enough at the time to want to.
Wait, so OMAC Project was one of the ones you didn't order.
I didn't.
Fascinating, because I we've talked multiple times about Greg Rucka, and I know we're both fans of his. Right, that's interesting.
But if you remember during our Rucka conversations, I didn't really hop fully on the Rucka train until a few years later. The name at the time didn't mean much to me
Yeah,
because he hadn't become the superstar that he is. And there was something about the sort of spy, espionage, technology corner of the DC universe that just didn't hit me then the way that it does now. And so I have a great appreciation for who Rucka is as a writer and what he's done since then, but didn't stay with me from the original reading.
I hear you. And we did an
Yeah.
episode of another podcast that I did called My Comic Shop Book Club, where we read the Greg Rucka detective run, which introduced
Right.
Sasha, who of course plays a huge role in Checkmate. So I'm sure
Yeah.
that probably landed more now that you had the backstory for her character. So that's cool.
Absolutely.
No, I totally get that. I'll say, generally speaking, I enjoyed this reread. To your point, what I think this whole era, I mean, maybe that's too much. We're only talking about a half a year period here, but still, this moment in DC, it really did do a great job of showing you the scope, the breadth of the DC universe, where you have Villains United, of course, dealing with the adversaries of the DC universe, coming out of Identity Crisis, right, where word has gotten out now about how the Justice League had magically lobotomized Dr. Light and these other characters, and now the villains are organizing amongst themselves, seeking protection, seeking retribution. So really picking up directly on those threads, but showing you the villain side of the DC universe. The RANN-THANAGAR War, showing you that outer space sci-fi scale. And what's interesting is, and I'm doing the math on this because I know Hal Jordan is back in this period that we're talking about, but we hadn't yet gotten into Sinestro Corps War time, right? So I think exploring this pocket of the DC universe felt fresher then, right? In the years to come, we would get so much of that spacefaring adventure from the Jeff Johns Green Lantern run, but here, I think this was again like a little bit of a different area to explore. The RANN-THANAGAR War did pick up from Adam Strange Planet Heist, the miniseries by Andy Diggle and Pasquale Ferry. Did you ever read that?
I do. It's on my shelf. I'm looking at it right now. It's across from me on the shelf.
It's really good. If I had
Yeah.
more time, I almost was like, oh, should I reread this? But I'm like, you got to draw the line somewhere. You got to draw the line somewhere. But it's really good. RANN-THANAGAR War stands well enough on its own. And I think they do a good job at the outset of establishing what had come before, all of this business about Rann being transported into orbit near Thanagar and sparking this intergalactic war. But the Planet Heist miniseries was really great for any Adam Strange fans, especially I know we had that recent Tom King miniseries, which I have not read yet, but for anyone who was really into that, you want more Adam Strange, that Planet Heist miniseries was great. I've been meaning to go back to that forever.
I had the same thought. I remembered that it was a lead in to this miniseries, and I thought, should I go back and then I just there was so much to read for this proper that I knew we were going to be talking about that I didn't, but I probably should at some point because I also remember it being really good, really
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And then, of course, Day of Vengeance dealing with the magical side of the DC universe, where the Spectre is once again without a host and running amok, has been influenced and corrupted by Jean Loring Eclipso, who herself is being manipulated. And we learn more in Infinite Crisis about Psycho Pirate was pulling the strings. But Spectre declares war on magic, and we have this ragtag, no pun intended, since Ragman is included, a bunch of magical characters waging this battle against Spectre. And then, of course, the OMAC project dealing with, as you said, the spy espionage side and really following most closely from the Countdown special and dealing with all of this business about Brother Eye, the satellite, and this army of OMACs. And we'll unpack all of that. But I'll just say, again, overall, I enjoyed it. I thought all of the miniseries were very readable. I know in other episodes we've done in this run, so I talked about some of them being kind of dense and hard to get through.
good.
Not the case here. I won't lie, it was almost the opposite in a couple of cases where some of them felt a little light. Like
Mm.
RANN-THANAGAR War, that Ivan Rice art, it's gorgeous and there's some great action. Overall felt a little light to me. I don't know that that necessarily needed 6 issues per se, right? But again, if you really have a deep connection to the Hawkman characters or to Adam Strange, you might feel differently. But for me, I felt like some of them maybe were a little bit on the light side. And then there's the other piece of this where, as the audience knows very well, the magical side of the DC universe doesn't necessarily light my fire, right? But I that doesn't mean these miniseries shouldn't exist, right? Like I really do love the idea, even though some of them speak to me more than others. I really like the idea that there was like, hey, we are going to show you the scope of the DC universe, and we're going to show you all 4 of these corners and how everything's going to hell before it all converges in this Infinite Crisis. So again, even if I liked some of them more than others, I appreciated that they were all there, and some of them are going to speak to other fans more than you did to me, and that's good.
No, absolutely. And you and I've talked about this a number of times. The magic side of the DC universe, it doesn't light my fire generally either. Um, in fact, when I'd finished reading all 4 miniseries, I was thinking about them in the aggregate, and I realized none of these really lit my fire in a technical sense. Like I'm not a big outer space battle kind of person. I'm not the technology. I like traditional superheroics. So, if it doesn't feature the JLA proper, I wouldn't expect to like it. But again, part of it was the discovery of the DC universe writ large. But what I really liked about these miniseries, they're for the most part pretty character driven. And so no matter what sort of weird stuff is going on. Um, the characters were interesting. So Day of Vengeance, right, was not really what I would normally pick up if I knew it hadn't been a lead into the big event. But I found a lot of the characters really delightful. Um, I knew nothing about Detective Chimp, for instance. I thought he was hilarious. I thought the idea of it was sort of ridiculous, but in a good way. Like it's just funny. Same thing with RANN-THANAGAR WAR. I mean, again, Ivan Rice's art is just stunning, and this is really before he became the superstar he would become with the Green Lantern books. But
Yeah, yeah.
um, but it's gorgeous stuff. And so not only do you have Adam Strange, who I knew next to nothing about, and the Hawks, but you've got the Green Lantern Corps in the middle of it. The Owens and the Tamaranians are in the middle of it, and so you've got enough, I think, cameos of characters I did know and have some kind of connection to, that I was able to get in on it. And the same thing with Villains United. I'm personally, I'm of the mind that villains generally don't carry their own books beyond like a mini series. I think villains work best in the context of the antagonist for the hero's arc. um, but you took the Secret Six and you essentially turned them into anti-heroes. And so you've got levels villainy, where you've got Luther's secret society, who are real villains, as you said, motivated by retribution against what was done to them by Zatanna, and and then you've got the Secret Six, who by default need to be more heroic, and they're a weird bunch of characters, but they work. There are relationships forming. There are backstabbings. I mean, there's all kinds of fun stuff. So even though on paper I shouldn't have been as into any of these series, I found that I was really into it.
That's awesome to hear. There really is a charm to, I would say, all of these, especially Villains United and Day of Vengeance, because you are dealing with these unlikely relationships and groups and more obscure characters, and so I think you have kind of a more of a blank canvas, right, for the
Mhm.
creators and for us as the audience. So,
Yeah.
those in particular, I did think were quite fun. The other big compliment that I have to pay them, and we are going to circle back to that countdown special, because
Yeah.
I will say, out of everything we read, far and away, I enjoyed that the most. I thought that was so
Same.
strong. Really, really loved it. Held up great. I just
Same.
thought it was such an engrossing read. So I want to talk about that. But the miniseries themselves, and people might disagree with me on this, but I guess going into the reread, I was saying to myself, I really wonder how well these are going to hold up generally, but more specifically as their own stories and not
Right.
just as lead-ins. And I have to say, and I want to get your take, like I felt that they do work on their own. Yes, they are dealing with elements, some books more so than others. I mean, RANN-THANAGAR WAR is really doing its own thing. And then at the end, you have this intergalactic or interdimensional rift that opens and you see the hand coming through. And yeah, when we get into Infinite Crisis, we'll find out that's Alexander Luthor trying to reshape the multiverse. And we'll also find out in Infinite Crisis what Alexander Luthor and Superboy Prime were doing behind the scenes in all of these books. And
Right.
for example, in the space side of things, Superboy Prime was rearranging planets and things like that. But still, you can read RANN-THANAGAR WAR and you have all of the pieces that you need. And I think, yeah, is it a 100% complete story? No, because it ends on a cliffhanger to this larger event. But for the most part, it wasn't. I didn't feel like these stories were just about the table setting, and so I enjoyed that about them. How did you feel?
Same. I mean, I think to varying degrees, they sort of ended on cliffhangers. There were some that had more definitive endings. I think Day of Vengeance had a little bit more of a definitive ending than the others, but that didn't bother me because, again, at the time, I knew that they were the lead-ins to the Crisis event. I knew that on the reread this time as well. I also remembered, and didn't have to look very far because they're on my shelf, but each one of these miniseries also had like an oversized one shot that came out in the middle of Infinite Crisis to
Yeah.
sort of wrap, and they were by the same creative teams, and they were designed to sort of wrap up that particular storyline. The disappointment for me was none of those are included in the trade paperbacks.
Yeah, they collected them in a companion trade, if I
Oh,
remember
is that what
correctly.
they did?
Yeah, and so so I did not
Ah,
reread them for this because I want to read them in their proper place. So we'll hit that next
yeah,
time. But yeah, they collected those because I would have to double check this. I
yeah,
feel like they probably pumped out the trades of the 6-issue miniseries quickly for
yeah,
people to catch up, and so that might have been why, because it would have been months later before the actual one shots came out. But yeah, I know. Yeah, and it was a companion trade, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah. And if that's the stated purpose of these miniseries is to lead into the main event, then I don't really have a problem with it. Again, I wonder to what extent the editors and writer are thinking about how these will read years and years later. I think the focus has to be on, what can we do to excite our audience now? As you said, sell books, boost sales, but what can we do to tell this story now? And however it presents later, we'll guess worry about it later or not. So yes, reading it now, almost 20 years later, it probably would have felt a little bit more satisfying if there were definitive endings to each of the miniseries, but that's just not what they were designed to do. So I can forgive that very, very easily because what they're designed to do, they do, and they do it well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I would, and I don't know. I would
Mhm.
imagine from the editorial side, there wasn't much concern about these standing on their own. I could be totally wrong, but I attribute to whatever extent these books do work on their own as, again, not totally complete stories, but mostly complete stories. I attribute that to the creators involved. And I think they gave these individual stories integrity despite the larger purpose that they had to serve. But regardless of where it comes from, I was pleasantly surprised as I was reading to find it. And the other thing too, and I wanted to ask you, I was going to save this for the end, but we'll talk about it now.
Sure.
I Some of this I had remembered and some I had forgotten, but these miniseries they do broaden the scope, and they introduce or reintroduce new characters and certainly new teams and dynamics. And so after Infinite Crisis, Villains United continued in the form of Secret Six, first a miniseries, then
Yep.
an ongoing, and then another ongoing in the New 52, if I'm not mistaken. Day of Vengeance continued post Infinite Crisis as Shadow Pact, an ongoing
Right.
series that
Right.
lasted a
Right.
couple of years. OMAC Project continued post Infinite Crisis as the Checkmate ongoing series, which lasted for a couple of years. And RANN-THANAGAR War didn't, if I'm not mistaken, didn't have as direct a follow up, but a little while later there was the RANN-THANAGAR Holy War miniseries. So those threads were continuing to develop as well. I've read none of those, which is, like that's the funny thing. But I don't know if that really, I don't know if that's a criticism of the original miniseries, or I think that probably speaks more to just kind of where I was as a fan coming out of Infinite Crisis. Not to go too far afield, and I've talked about this on various podcasts over the years, but after Infinite Crisis, I did make the decision to stop reading monthly and I switched to trade. And at the time, it made the most sense for all of the reasons that we always make the arguments for reading reading the trades. And as we're sitting here, I see your massive, graphic novel library behind me. I know you know what I'm talking about here.
Yep.
But there was it did lose a little something for me because I wasn't as plugged in. There wasn't that immediacy. There wasn't that that excitement that I was getting. Now, I think that was also due in part to I guess the way I felt coming out of Infinite Crisis. I reread it a few years ago. We did a Patreon episode about it, and of course, I'll be rereading it for next week's episode. And I think I've really come to appreciate Infinite Crisis a lot more now than I did at the time. I think if I'm remembering correctly, I feel like coming out of Infinite Crisis, it just felt like okay. Like I don't know that it quite lived up to all of that excitement, all of that buildup, all of that anticipation, and that's not necessarily a fault of the book. It might have just been like there was all of this buildup, and my expectations were somewhere that they shouldn't have been. I don't know, but anyway, coming out of Infinite Crisis, I think my enthusiasm had been dampened a little bit, and I was also just interested in reading in a different way. And so my whole reading and collecting career, kind of shifted a little bit. So I wasn't as dialed in. And that might in part account for why I never read any of those follow ups. I don't know. Even now, even though I enjoyed these miniseries, I won't lie. It's not like I'm sitting here being like, Scott, when we're done, I'm going to pull up that app and I'm going to dig into the Shadow Pact series. I wasn't that moved to do it, but I say all of that to say, like, yeah, it was setting up Infinite Crisis, but it was also broadening the DCU, and then you had these teams that continued. So I think it was building in a number of ways. Did you ever read any of those follow-ups? And if not, are you moved to read any of them now?
No and no.
Okay.
Um, oh, no, I felt very, very similar to the way that you just described, which is I was satisfied with the miniseries that led up. I was excited to have learned about some of these new characters, but outside of the context of building toward the big event that I knew I was going to read, I didn't really want to spend the time or the money to continue with them. Plus, um, DC's publishing strategy coming out of Infinite Crisis to me pointed in a different direction, which was, as we're going to find out, the 52 weekly series, and this sort of 1 year later um, branding on a lot of their major books, where some of the major heroes, the Trinity included, um, basically were out of commission for a year. The 52 limited series filled in the gap of that year, but essentially Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman are off the board, and their books pick up a year later, and the status quo has changed. And I was far more interested in finding out what that was all about. So I was still reading a lot of the major hero titles and then the 52 weekly series. And so that's where I really put my attention and my money and was in that. So I just didn't have the bandwidth, I think, to factor in all those other series. And at this stage, I just don't see myself wanting to go back and check them. I don't know what I could possibly derive from them at this point.
Gotcha. I know, I understand. So I want to circle back and talk more about the individual miniseries, though. I won't lie. For some of them, I don't like have a ton to say, but we'll talk about it. Right, unsurprisingly, have the most when we get back to OMAC and that sacrifice
Yeah.
story. I don't. There's not a ton of Superman in terms of what we're talking about here, and when what there is, I don't love. It's not my favorite, but we'll talk about it. But we have to get back to this countdown special because this
Yes.
is what kicked it off, and I think really regardless of how anyone feels about Identity Crisis, and we talked about it at length last week, but I think this special does a really great job of bridging that into this larger mega arc that we're getting within DC, and again continuing along a lot of those themes. So this is a 80-page one shot for $1. So they wanted everyone in on this, and it was hard to pass up. And it follows Ted Cord, Blue Beetle, as he is conducting this investigation where he's discovered that money, or with the help of Oracle, money has been siphoned from his company. One of his warehouses gets hit. There are multiple attempts on his life. And he pursues this investigation throughout the DC universe, seeking help of his supposed allies, and is largely dismissed, with the exception of Blue Beetle, his best friend, who even Blue Beetle initially has other more important things to do. He has to go film a commercial, but he eventually circles back around. Wonder Woman shows him the most courtesy and respect as he's making his way through, but for the most part, again, he is largely dismissed. What was interesting to me about that in particular, and when I say this thematically really felt like a continuation from Identity Crisis, one of the things that I think Identity Crisis did masterfully was showed really this community aspect on both the hero side and the villain side, that there are these real personalities and personality conflicts and tensions and hierarchies. And as I was reading this, just like you see in Identity Crisis, how the villain community doesn't think highly of Captain Boomerang, for example. Now we're on the other side here, and I don't mean, for any Blue Beetle fans, I don't mean it's like the Captain Boomerang of the heroes, but you kind of see that lack of respect that he's met with as he's making his way through, and eventually, spoilers, I think people are well familiar with these story points at this point in time, but eventually he follows his investigation all the way to Checkmate headquarters and discovers that Max Lord, the former organizer of the Bwahaha version of the Justice League, is the Black King of Checkmate and has been behind everything that Ted Cord has been investigating. And it ends with Beetle's brutal murder at the hands of Max Lord. So that's sort of the broad strokes, the overview of that Countdown special. So I mean, toss it to you. Where would you like to go first here?
Well, first of all, you mentioned it's an 80-page issue for $1. So clearly the company is thinking about future profits and not trying to actually make the money on this, because I'm sure they lost money on it. But they also marketed it by having a cover drawn by Jim Lee and then painted on top of that by Alex Ross. So they're taking, two probably of the most accomplished artists at the time and probably still to today, and having them collaborate on this cover that features in the foreground Batman holding a body and the other superheroes looking on, in dismay. And so, there's a lot of intrigue. If they can't sell you this issue based on all of that, then they're doing everything wrong. And I think that they did everything right, because I think this issue sold incredibly, incredibly well. And once you've read it, I think it does make you want to continue on wherever the story is going to lead. I think you mentioned a couple of points about the story itself that are really important to note. Number one, Blue Beetle sort of rose to whatever prominence he was going to achieve, I think, through that Bwahaha Justice League incarnation. Um, and because the tone of that book was much more humorous, I think by the time we got to this Infinite Crisis special, we forgot that Blue Beetle is actually a really accomplished detective. He's essentially, he's Batman without the tragedy. He is rich, so he has access to all these toys and all this equipment and all this Beetle themed instead of Bat themed. Um, and just a sort of lighter outlook on life in general, but he is an accomplished detective, more than capable of trying to solve this mystery. And the fact that he doesn't get the kind of cooperation from his fellow heroes, I think speaks to what his place was in the DC universe at the time. He was kind of dismissed, kind of a joke, other than Booster Gold, with whom he has a friendship. He's kind of a nothing. And I don't remember what was done with Blue Beetle up until this point. I can't remember him in any place of prominence in the years leading up to this.
Nor
So
can I. Nor can I.
yeah,
Did you read that Keith Giffen, J.M.D. Mateus, Kevin Maguire Justice League run?
not in its entirety, but I have the trade of the first arc of it, which is just phenomenal. And then some of the later entries that they made in miniseries form. There was one called like formerly known as the Justice League, or I
Hmm.
can't believe it's not the Justice League. Same creative team, and I just found them wildly entertaining, and those characters really just wonderful. But they have that place in DC that doesn't always translate well when you try to insert them into other stories. Like, we're coming off of Identity Crisis, one of the darkest stories, and this sort of era being one of the darkest periods in DC, which I think Infinite Crisis proper actually comments on in a sort of meta commentary way. Um, and so to take the tone of that Wahaha and insert it here, I think would have been really off-putting. So instead, I appreciate that they took Blue Beetle and made him a little bit more serious. There's still a little bit of humor, but for the most part, he's a straight up he's a straight up detective, which led me to believe at the time that they were bringing Blue Beetle back to some sort of prominent role, and putting him in the same way that they did for Elongated Man and in Identity Crisis. And instead, they dispatch him at the end. I mean, brutally. It was quite shocking. I mean, he's shot in the head, and although that the panel where he shot is all in silhouette, I mean, it's detailed enough for a silhouette. Um, and that shock was unexpected, but I found really entertaining and interesting, and I really wanted to find out what was going on. And of course, to have Max Lord be the mastermind at the center of it made a lot of sense in context of the Wahaha era, because Max Lord was the sort of benefactor of that whole era. So I was just completely on board through this whole thing. I thought Blue Beetle was a great focal character to follow. I thought it reminded us what was great about him. And then, in true DC fashion, the way to continue reminding us what makes him great is to kill him.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess a couple of things. So I still to this day have not read that Wahaha era of the Justice League, and Justice League wise, I would say that's really my lone remaining true gap. Because especially over the course of our Crisis on Multiple Earths episode, reading a selection of Silver and Bronze Age Justice League stories, again, I really only scooped a cup of water out of the ocean, but I at least have a sense, right, of those eras. And from Grant Morrison forward, I've either read all of it or at least some arcs, and I'm familiar with them. But that period of time, post Crisis, before the Morrison Big Seven era, has long been a gap. And I will say, unlike the other stories that came out of Infinite Crisis that we were just talking about, reading this does make me more intrigued to go back and check out some of that. So at some point for some podcast, I'm sure I will, because I am curious. But to the credit of Johns and Winnick and Rucka, I really have to give them a ton of credit, because I did not have the background, the history, the familiarity, the affinity for that version of the Justice League. Knew next to nothing about Max Lord or Blue Beetle. As we've talked about in The Death of Superman, that's the version of the Justice League that we're dealing with. So I had met those characters. I had some familiarity with, but it wasn't like I really had any attachment. And despite that, I was all in on this story. So the fact that it worked as well as it did without that connection, I think really speaks volumes. And I know I'm a broken record about this, but I love me a point of view character. And in most of these events, we don't have that. And here you follow Blue Beetle throughout this whole story. And it I learned who he was and I learned what he was about and I was invested in his investigation and his story. And to see it end the way it does, when we get to those final pages and we have his inner narration, and he starts to say again, my name is Ted Cord. I'm the Blue Beetle. I'm the second Blue Beetle. I hope there'll be a third. It's like, where this is going. And it just, it just hits you. I thought it was so effective.
No, and I agree, and I realize too that for the sake of some listeners who may also be unfamiliar with the Blue Beetle character, we are talking about the Ted Cord version of the character and not the Jaime Reyes character who would come later, who's going to be featured in a blockbuster movie in not that long. And so if you're thinking it's going to be that Blue Beetle, it's not. This sort of paved the way for the creation of that Blue Beetle. We had to get rid of the one incarnation so the next one could rise, and as you've hinted at. Um,
Yeah.
so that's I think important if people were going to read this expecting it to be the Blue Beetle from the movie. It's not.
Yeah. Oh, Scott, how kind of you to call it a blockbuster movie. Boy, that's generous. Warner Brothers thanks
Well,
you. We
well,
thank you.
a big budget movie. How about big budget? It's got a big budget.
All right. Yeah. But but kind of the flip of what I was just saying, and again, I know you don't have the history with that version of the Justice League, so I guess this is more for our audience here, because this came up when we talked about Identity Crisis last week. This notion of, hey, Identity Crisis is telling you that those Silver and Bronze Age stories that you read featuring the Justice League, there was more going on behind the scene, between the panels, right?
Mm.
In terms of this dark history and in terms of the actions that the Justice League had taken against these villains. So all those stories you read where the villains were silly and ineffectual, this is why, because the Justice League did stuff to them. And similarly here, Max even says, he explicitly articulates, he's like, why do you think I kept the League so ineffectual for all of those years? And so I wonder, just as I wondered last week about fans of the Bronze Age Justice League, I wonder too, for real diehard fans of the Giffen, DeMatteis, Maguire era of Justice League, how this lands with them. Is it the sort of thing where it, does it ruin those old stories? Like, can you go back and read those old stories and not have evil Max Lord and Ted Cord with his brain splattered all over the wall in your head? Like, I genuinely wonder, like, not having that attachment, we're not put off by that, right? It's just like, oh, wow, like those kind of silly stories that we know a little bit about, this explains so much about them. Like, it's so cool. But if you were really in on that, I do wonder.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would imagine that the folks who grew up in that later Silver Age and Bronze Age and were reading those stories as kids, where essentially the good guys and the bad guys were unambiguously good and evil, respectively. Um, there is a comfort to that. That's sort of traditional superhero storytelling going all the way back to for the most part, the Golden Age. I just think I remember thinking at the time, and it's coming back to me now, that this era, because it's so meta, um, is looking at the entire publishing history of DC and saying essentially, like, our audiences are more mature than they had been, even if they were the same age. The modes of storytelling have evolved, and so to continue telling those same stories again with unambiguous good and bad, um, just doesn't work for a 21st century audience. And so to take your heroes and to make them more complex, more nuanced, to take your villains and make them in some ways kind of relatable, I can get behind being uh really angry at the idea of heroes messing with your mind. It's one thing to imprison you and punish you for your crimes, but to change fundamentally who you are and how you behave, that seems like a violation over and above. And so to have villains acting on that makes them a lot more relatable. And I think we really were I think we were ready for it. And I think to call back to an era of Justice League and say, we know how this presents, and you can still read it that way, unironically if you want. But for the sake of a 21st century audience, we're going to kind of explain why some of the villains were goofy and why the Justice League was a comedy book for a while, and you know, kind of bridge all of that together to create what is in essence this much more cohesive DC universe, both sort of in breadth across the universe, but also in the depth of time that the stories are unfolding from 1938 to what was at the time the present.
Well said. And it's funny, when I bring up these questions, I guess I'm speaking for those fans, right, with those attachments to those eras. But again, they might not have an issue with this as I'm speculating. So I'm sure there's a mix. But your points are all well taken. And the other thing I'll say, kind of in defense of shining this kind of light on these older stories, whether we're talking the satellite era or even the you know the international version of the Justice
Right.
League, is that at least it's referencing those stories. It's bringing those stories back to light, to prominence, actually, doing something with that material, as opposed to them being these runs, these eras that are just kind of there in the past and you can look at your back issues. So again, kind of regardless of where you land on this, it's like, hey, at least it's incorporating these periods of the DC universe and sort of making it all feel of a piece. Again, for better or worse, because I think what Identity Crisis and what this Countdown special, like what they're doing, it is bringing those stories into the fold. And you might not like the way they do that, but they are doing that. So I think that's a really interesting piece of all of this. And again, as far as following Beetle throughout this, and the special, again, 80 pages, and it's not unlike the miniseries themselves, it has table setting to do, right? It is teeing up each of the miniseries to follow, and some are more direct than others. Like we said, I think Countdown really leads very directly into the OMAC project, following Max Lord as the Black King of Checkmate, and you see, especially as we get into OMAC, how he has really usurped the traditional hierarchy and organizational structure of Checkmate, this spy organization within the DC universe, where we have, the Black Kings and Queens, and they're supposed to work in unison. And you get the sense like he has just really set himself up as the authoritarian figure of this. And then, of course, the further revelations about the Brother Eye satellite that had been created by Batman to spy on the heroes of the DC universe to keep them in check after he realized what they had done, not only to Dr. Light, but also to himself. We'll talk more about that.
Mm-hmm.
So, there you really get that very clear continuation. Some of the connection points, the other miniseries, are a little bit more tangential, but I still thought they worked for the most part in the context of this. So just as an example, when Blue Beetle is seeking Martian Manhunter's help, they're interrupted by this communication from Adam Strange talking about this war that's broken out between Rann and Thanagar. And so it might feel a little tacked on, but again, it gives you this glimpse into what's going on throughout the rest of the DC universe, and in a way that because you can envision a different kind of a countdown special that really was far more concerned with setting up the individual miniseries. And here it was really Ted's story, and then you were touching on these other aspects. And I think thematically, something like that interruption about the RANN-THANAGAR War, it fit in exactly with what was going on in terms of Ted's story of being dismissed, of being overlooked. Like literally, as he's seeking Martian Manhunter's help, something more important comes up that, of course, has captured his interest far more so than Blue Beetle's plight here. So I thought that worked well. The business about lightning striking Ted's house, and of course that's what puts Blue Beetle in the hospital, or Booster Gold in the hospital. And then, Ted realizes, like lightning came down from the sky. I need to talk to Captain Marvel, and he brings the Scarab to Fawcett City, and then that leads him to the door to the Rock of Eternity, and he's talking with the Wizard. That to me felt like, all right, guys, that felt a little like, again, now that might just be my personal feelings about the magical side of the DC universe. That felt the least, I think, organic as far as the proceedings overall, but it still works.
No, and you're right about that. I think that the overall the planning leading into this issue, the issue itself, out into the miniseries, out into Infinite Crisis, and then post Infinite Crisis, I think the planning was really, really good. Um, in the introduction to the Villains United trade, there's a sort of, a sort of recap page, although it's several pages, and they flash sort of a panel from a previous comic, fairly recent, and they tell you from Teen Titans issue whatever, or from Wonder Woman issue whatever. And then there's a little paragraph summary of what happened in that, just a brief thing. And you can really see how so many stories from so many different titles were dovetailing into what would become this countdown special. And so then it's up to this special to feature not each one of those mentions, but certainly those sort of four corners of the DC universe, in addition to the sort of center main superhero, feature piece. And so I give them a lot of credit for just planning it well. But I agree with you. I think that you could have broken this down into, four 20-page sections, each one focusing on the corner of the DC universe that would later become one of these. And they didn't do that. And I applaud them for not doing that, because they were able to tell a much more linear story that I felt was much more compelling, with just hints that things are going on elsewhere. And if you never chose to follow up on those, I don't think you really lose that much. But if you choose to follow those paths into these miniseries, I think the experience of reading the event becomes a lot richer, because the main crisis event is going to follow up on those. But I don't think that you'd really be lost if you didn't experience them. Which is not an I don't I know that sounds like sort of a knock at them, like it's non-essential reading, but I think that that's the design of a really good line-wide event, where you don't want your readership to have to pay for every single issue across the entire line that even mentions the big event. You want them to explore the corners that are appealing to them and still feel like they got the full story in the main crossover title. So, in looking at just sort of the macro design of it, I really appreciate where it's going. And so that's one of the reasons I think this issue was really successful for me and so enjoyable. Like you, of all the parts of this entire crossover, that issue is the one I've reread the most. And it
Gotcha.
still holds up. It's still so fun. It's still intriguing. Even after I know the big reveal, now I'm looking for the clues of like what was dropped early on that then pays off later, knowing the payoff. So yeah, I can't say enough good things about this issue. I think it's masterful. You got three of the best writers in the business. Certainly at the time, they were all at the peak of their respective powers. You've got a slew of phenomenal artists, all of whom were doing just crazy good work in DC at the time. So there's really not much to not sell this issue.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And again, going back to the miniseries, like that was one of the things that I was struck by, that, like we said before, that they do largely stand on their own, and that they're not, yes, there are crumbs that are sprinkled in there that are important. In Villains United, I think one of the biggest pieces, critical pieces, that you want to make sure you're picking up on as you're going through, right, is that for a period in the DCU, we had the former president of the United States, Lex Luthor, running around in his green war suit, and then we had this black-clad Lex Luthor who was organizing the villains. And there was a little stretch there where it seemed like there was a discrepancy in terms of what's going on with Lex. He seems to be presented in two different ways. And then and I believe it's in Villains United, I think this is the first instance where it's like, no, there's two of them. And then of course we find out that the one who's been organizing the villains is actually Alexander Luthor in disguise. But obviously that's a key piece of information. But big picture, and I agree with you. I think for them, maybe with the exception of OMAC, but even there, it's like, if you skipped any of these, you can still go into Infinite Crisis and you can follow it. It's mostly, I feel like mostly what these miniseries are doing are just showing you again how everything is falling apart across the DC universe. There's this war on magic, intergalactic war has broken out. We have this army of OMACs hunting people, and the villains have united and have organized. And as long as you kind of have those broad strokes, I think you're good to go. And then going back to that countdown special, since it is 80 pages, it's almost the equivalent of four, like it's almost its own 6-issue miniseries.
Yeah.
It's basically the equivalent of a 4-issue miniseries. So I think that too, and I like we were saying, I think just the structure of it was very sophisticated, given what this could have very easily been. So I give them credit. And then the last thing I'll say on the just kind of like the planning side of it, regardless of how much was editorially driven, I have always gotten the sense about this era from reading interviews with the creators, guys like Johns, Rucka, Winnick, Jeff Loeb. It really seemed like there was a friendship and a collaboration. And I think even before we got into these more, more strictly outlined crossovers and events and things like that, you kind of always there were little threads throughout the books in this era where it felt like they were building off of what the other one was doing. Even as I'll talk about this more next week, but in the Infinite Crisis back matter, Jeff Johns talks about how, as he recalls, it was Jeff Loeb who suggested, hey, why don't you use those 4 characters who went off into the paradise dimension at the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths? So the like maybe the most critical piece of
Hmm.
Infinite Crisis, came from one of these guys who were writing the books, and there was this friendship there. So I think even though clearly this is so mapped out and so planned and obviously a huge editorial piece, I do think on the creative side, or at least I've always gotten the sense that there was that friendship, cooperation, collaboration. I think that comes through. I think to the point that, to the extent that any of this feels organic, I think it comes from that.
I think you're right, because if you look at this era, like what other era of mainstream superhero comics can you remember having so many writer collaborations? I mean, it's not unusual, especially in an issue this size, to have multiple artists, but it's not that common. Other than, there are certain writing teams, partnerships, Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray are a team, Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning are a team. But
Not anymore.
oh no, well, not anymore. But for years they had been writing together. There were just partnerships. But to have 3 individual superstar writers collaborating on the same project, and when we get to 52, you'll see it's again a collaboration of multiple writers, who are, each one has their specialty and their, the mode in which they sort of choose to write, and characters they sort of gravitate towards. But I feel like this is a really unusual time in which the writers were able to, say, put their egos aside, because I don't really think it's that, but just sort of, their individual writing assignments they still were able to do, and then like a brain trust, like a group of architects who were sort of building the future of the DC universe. And I mean, look, the names that you rattled off, like it doesn't get better than that at this time in comics. I mean, these are absolute masters of their crafts, or people who are sort of working towards becoming masters of their craft, who are pretty close. And I think that's a lot of why this issue is so successful. And then to have some of them go off and write their own miniseries, and then of course Jeff Johns, who would write, the Crisis miniseries itself. And there's just, you're right. I think there's something that felt more connected, that felt more collaborative about this, because I think it was.
Absolutely. When as you were talking about that brain trust idea, of course, the Triangle era Superman books come to mind, where you had that level of planning and cooperation among the teams, and that for years. There was, of course, the Brand New Day era of Amazing Spider-Man, where similarly you had that kind of brain trust. And then what we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, 52, right, where you had Morrison, Johns, Rucka, and Wade, right, all working together.
Agreed.
And yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said for that. But
Yeah.
uh, I want to make sure we get into the Superman of it all here.
Yeah.
So we go again, following I think the most direct thread from the Countdown special, right, where we find out that Max Lord is pulling these strings. And between the special and more so the OMAC Project miniseries, what we find out is that he has wrestled control over this Brother Eye satellite away from Batman. And additionally, he in hitting Ted's warehouse, and stealing kryptonite, it turns out that was just a cover, but rather there was this EMP device that had not yet been delivered to the warehouse that could be used against the OMACs, and Max was trying to to get ahead of that. And so that kind of brings us into this OMAC project miniseries here. And Max's motivation here, it seems to be driven by this idea that comes up a lot, this notion that power can't be entrusted to these godlike beings, that humanity needs to be in control. Of course, ironically, Max himself is a metahuman, and he has the ability to, as they describe it, push minds.
Hmm.
And we see it in the countdown special where he forces Ted to drop the gun, and he gets a nosebleed where Max gets a nosebleed when he's doing this.
Hmm.
But that seems to be this driving motivation here, and again, thematically, really pays off really nicely with what had just come before an Identity Crisis, because that book showed you, okay, these people who can erase memories and rewrite minds and change personalities, well, they are employing that power and they are arguably misusing that power, right? So we need to step in. We need to have the means to stop them. And at the end of that special, he offers the choice is join or die, right? And he what the other thing about this? I know I said I was done with the special, but the one thing about it is just that Ted is positioned as just this ultimate underdog, right? He is seeing these connection points. He is pursuing this investigation, and it's not like he has no friends or allies throughout the DC universe, but again, he is again largely dismissed or at least underestimated, and it's Max who seems to have placed the most faith in him, right, to figure this out and to offer him a place. And of course, Ted refuses, but again, I think just such a powerful moment in it. Oh, this was the other thing I wanted to say, especially building off of Identity Crisis. So we spent a lot of time last week talking about the women in refrigerators trope, and I'm not going to rehash that whole thing. We talked about it, but it's interesting because I've seen here and there people criticizing Ted's death in this special as just, a cheap plot point, right? For fans of the character to see Ted meet his end like that. And, everyone has their own opinion, as always, but especially having just looked at Identity Crisis again and spent a lot of time reading about the women in refrigerators argument and really considering it, there's a vast difference, I feel, between what is done to Sue, right, in Identity Crisis and the reasons for which it is done versus what we see here, where we follow like this is Ted's story. Yes, it ends the way it does, but you are with Ted. You learn everything you need to learn about him. You see how all of this is affecting him. He is driving the story. And then yes, he meets that end. But again, I certainly would not put them in the same category because I really feel like this is maybe this is the sort of the kind of treatment that we would want to see for, again, female characters, right? In other instances, right? But so I don't know, that was kind of the other thing that was kicking around as I was reading this.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at it in the context of the issue itself, then yeah, Ted is the driving force of this story, and so whatever happens to him is to further his own story. But if you look at it in the larger DC universe context, his death is the catalyst for what the other heroes are going to do moving forward. So you could look at it as, they only killed him in order to motivate other characters to do what they're going to do. I think it reads differently when it is a female character who is offed in order to further male characters' stories. I think that's really what's at the heart of that whole fridging notion. Whereas when the male character dies, even if it is to further other male character stories, um, it just doesn't have it doesn't have that same feeling for me. I mean, because again, the whole idea is that it's a knock on females. It is a way of saying that females are only important in a story if they advance the male hero's story. And I never felt like, even in the grand scheme of things, that that's what was happening here. I mean, there have to be inciting incidents in stories, and sometimes those inciting incidents are a death or an injury, or something horrible has to happen to force the characters to act. And I didn't have that problem here. Maybe if they had used a female character as the centerpiece, I might have felt differently, but we have what we have, so you know.
Yeah. No, I mean, and your point is well taken. It's like, yes, this does become a motivator for the characters moving beyond this story, but in the context of this one, you see the fulfillment of Ted's quest, and I feel like
Yeah.
that's a major distinction, right? Where you're following him, and he's concluded his investigation. He's figured out what he needed to figure out. He's really kind of come to the end of there was a journey here, and we've reached the end of it. Even though that yes, the death itself will be used as this plot point to push forward other stories as we make our way. But
Yeah. And it helps
anyway,
to establish Max Lord as the mastermind and to start to showcase what it is he can do. I mean, the fact that he had metahuman powers, that was new. We didn't know that. And given what he's going to do to Superman in the Sacrifice crossover, we need that lead up. I think we need to see him getting worse and worse to do more heinous things as the story goes on. And so this is just the beginning. And yeah, it works for me.
and I'd be talking about how everyone is kind of dismissive of Ted as he's investigating, but I think yes, that points to the way most of the other characters see him generally, but also it does track because all of the characters they've got their own stuff going on here. I'll use Batman maybe as the biggest example, where
Yeah.
Ted goes to the Batcave to ask for Bruce's help, because in following the money trail, right? There was a reference in one of the documents, the OMAC project, right? And he mentions this to Batman, and Batman wants nothing to do with him, and it's heartbreaking. We get Ted's narration, and he's talking about how Bruce has these mementos of all of his adventures as Batman, but nothing from his time on their version of the Justice League. And it's kind of heartbreaking, and Bruce really doesn't have time for him, but we know, that, or I guess at this point we are learning that he knows what was done to him by the Justice League. Because coming out of Identity Crisis, there's this open question, which we talked about, with both Batman and Superman. Well, how much do they know about what the League did to the villains and what the League did to Batman? And with Superman in particular, is this idea of, well, he hears what he wants to hear, sort of thing. And as we move through these other stories, it becomes a lot clearer as far as what exactly each of them know. But I think in this countdown special, this is really the first instance that it's becoming clear Bruce knows what was done to him, and that's the motivator behind spying on them. And then in the OMAC project, he there's that conversation in the Watchtower. It's like a Superman and Wonder Woman, and I think Booster is there at that point as well, where he's explaining like he knows what was done to him. And you see you get to see kind of how he pieced that together, right? There are moments where he was in similar positions in battle or things like that, and things were triggering his memory. So we're seeing that piece of it unfold. Then in the middle of the OMAC project, this was I don't know, like the ballsiest choice I feel like a publisher can make where, hey, we're doing this big event coming up. We have 4 lead-in miniseries. Now, look, as you and I have talked about, you don't have to read them all, but still, there's 4 lead-in miniseries. And by the way, in the middle, in between issues 3 and 4
Yeah.
of one of them, you go off and, and you buy these 4 other issues where Max Lord pushes Superman's mind and turns him into this killing machine where he is experiencing these visions. He thinks he's seeing Brainiac with Lois, Darkseid with Lois, Doomsday with Lois, and he's defending her. And as we find out, it's actually Batman he is pummeling and really just doing a number on him. And this is building, of course, to the massive payoff with Wonder Woman, and we'll talk about. But just, I don't know, just as far as this decision to shoehorn this crossover in the middle of a miniseries. So, how do you feel about that?
Uh, you know, I don't think I saw it as clearly at the time because each series was its own thing. When they collect it in trade and they decide to put, the fourth part of the Sacrifice crossover into the OMAC Project trade, not the other 3 parts, but just part 4, and then they have a recap of the other 3 parts. Now, fortunately, I also have the Superman Sacrifice trade paperback, which has like the 1 or 2 issues leading into, and then 1 issue I think leading out of, and it's got everything in it that you need. Now I sort of see better how it fits. I don't know at the time that I mean, other than what Wonder Woman ultimately does to Max Lord, I don't think I really saw all of the connective pieces, but I don't know. I probably should rub up against it more, but I don't. I found it to be fine, and I don't know that it would have worked to either have it as its own fifth miniseries leading into things, or to have had it as part of the OMAC project miniseries. I don't know that either of those would have worked as well as just having these things happening in the Superman titles, and then of course in the Wonder Woman titles as well, and just having the effects of it happen, because we do get a repeat of the scene with Wonder Woman and Max Lord in OMAC project proper. So I don't know. I
No,
didn't
that's
have
fine.
a problem with it.
And here's the thing. I mean, I at the time I was reading all the books anyway. I was
Right, me
obviously
too.
reading all the Superman books. I was reading Rucka's Wonder Woman, so it wasn't like anything additional. But I don't know, especially in retrospect, I'm just kind of like, guys, like, what are you doing here? But it's fine. um, so I'm not surprised that they only included the concluding chapter of Sacrifice in the OMAC trade because those Superman issues that tie into it, they're fine, but it's
Yeah,
really just Superman thinks he's fighting someone, and then it turns out he's not. And we kind of get you
right.
see that play out a few times, right? Until you get this reveal. The Rucka Adventures issue is more relevant. I think the biggest thing that you get there is Jean probes Clark's mind and sees that Max Lord has done this. So, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's the first instance where our characters at large are like, oh, it's Max Lord, right? Ted had found out but was killed. So this is now sort of, sharing that bit of information. But then, yeah, really it's that Wonder Woman issue where, again, Max is puppeteering Superman and pitting him against Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman is able to get Max Lord in her lasso, and Max lets Superman free for a moment, and essentially is explaining like I'm gonna keep doing this to him. You can't stop me. And while he's under the influence of the lasso, she says, "What can I do?" And he says, "Kill me." And in a very famous moment, which we have seen echoed on screen in different
Mm-hmm.
forms, Wonder Woman snaps Max's neck, killing him and freeing Superman from this mind control.
And it's
And
publicly broadcast across the entire planet.
yeah, at the end of the OMAC project, this is publicly broadcast. And also just a quick plot bit, but following Max's death, Brother Eye, this spy satellite, it becomes autonomous. And we'll later find out in Infinite Crisis, Alexander Luthor was pulling the strings there. But and then the OMAC army just goes berserk, and that's propelling us into Infinite Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, let me toss it to you. I guess, how do you feel? We'll get to the killing in a minute, but and yeah, folks, we'll mention Man of Steel. How could we not? But here's I was thinking about this. It's like, regardless of what you feel about the Snyder movies, man, have they given us a lot to talk about. And as the podcaster,
Absolutely.
and I enjoy the movies, but as a podcaster, I'm just like endlessly grateful because it's like, man, there's always a lot to talk about. Anyway, how do you feel about Superman being susceptible to this mind control in the first place, I guess? Because it is established that Max had been building to this for years, apparently, right? He had been whatever it is that he's doing to allow himself to gain this level of control, right? It wasn't like, oh, all of a sudden he just pushed Superman to kill, right? He had been working his way up to this, kind of planting the seeds for it in Superman's mind for quite some time. But how do you feel about that?
I was I'm fine with it. I think it's a perfectly valid choice. I think that for a character who has relatively few weaknesses, I think mind control, telepathy, that kind of thing, it is perfectly reasonable, right? He's vulnerable to kryptonite, he's vulnerable to magic, he's vulnerable to sort of outside mental manipulation. Um, and that's kind of it. So I'm fine with it, and I think it leads to the larger debate, which, I mean, let's face it, fans of superhero comics have had for years. Not just the debate over, when, if ever, is it okay for a hero to kill a villain, but you know, I guess you know what are you protecting against when you do that? Um, it raises questions that Batman has had to field for a long time, including here, which is, Batman's notoriously sort of kept detailed notes and tabs on pretty much every superpowered being in the DC universe. And even in the case of some of his closest friends and allies, um, ways to take them down or ways to, if necessary, kill them. We've seen it in a number of different ways, um, in across media. I mean, one of my favorite DC animated projects is Justice League Doom, where Batman, the Justice League essentially finds out that Batman has these plans, and they don't know how to feel about it. So I think there are a lot of interesting questions that are raised, and I think they're real world questions about what do you do if you live in a universe where people are have the powers of gods, and for the most part, they're choosing to use them in a pro-social, protective way. But what do you do if those people are corrupted? And again, whether from within or from without, what do you do? You have to have a contingency. You have to. And so if you have someone as powerful as Superman who's being used as a weapon against his will, you have to have a way to stop him. You have to have a way to take him down. That then led very naturally into the question of, did Wonder Woman do the right thing? And it became not just a question for the readers to grapple with, which I love, but it became a question within the DC universe itself because everybody on the planet saw it happen. And so people wondering, did she do the right thing? And it creates a really interesting debate. It divides the heroes, it divides the villains, it divides the entire world. And these are questions we've been having on a non-meta level for decades. So to have it happen on a meta level, I thought was really great.
Yeah, it's funny because as a fan, as a Superman fan, I'm just like, that wouldn't he wouldn't allow that to happen to him. That you wouldn't be able to do that to Superman. That's kind of like the
Yeah,
gut reaction. I'm like, Clark, you would have been able to withstand that.
yeah,
But on a story, for looking at it from a story perspective, no, I agree with you because I think that this is now forcing the issue, right? This is the question, right? Can these beings be entrusted with this power? And yeah, to your point, it's like even if you can trust them when they're acting of their own accord, there are these instances where there's not. That's why I always look at Batman as one of these keys to understanding Superman, because
yeah,
you entrust Batman with that kryptonite ring, you give him the means to step in if need be, and that helps explain. Because again, once again, a Snyder quote, but Bruce at the start of Batman v Superman, this whole bit about if there's even a 1% chance that he can take us out, we have to treat that as an absolute certainty.
yeah,
And it's like it's if we're really looking at this through as realistic a lens as possible, it's reasonable to kind of come to that. And again, Max proves his own point here, right? Where he's like, I'm doing this because you guys can't be trusted with this. Now, yes, he's the one who's ultimately making this happen, but it could have been someone else. And so he is
yeah,
showing why there is this need to be able to stop these characters. So, yeah, I mean, again, as a fan, it's like the notion of Superman just being puppeteered by Max Lord, not my favorite thing in the world. I guess I did appreciate because earlier in the story, Max tries to use his mental abilities on Sasha, and she's
hmm
weirdly able to withstand it. And as I'm reading that, I'm like, what the hell? So she can withstand this, but Superman can't. But again, this whole idea that he's been working on Superman for a long time,
yeah,
I can get on board with it because again, I think it is really important for where we're going here. As far as Wonder Woman killing Max, it's so funny because when Wonder Woman 1984 was coming out and we knew that Max Lord was the antagonist
yeah.
there, we were all kind of speculating, well, we know how their story turns out in the comics, but we had another recent DC movie where the villain's neck was snapped, so I don't think that's going to happen here. And obviously, they went the route of I don't know, whatever she did in that movie. She used her spirit to talk to people. I did not like that movie. Anyway, but
Mm.
but it was funny going into that. Like, how are they going to handle this? What where I get frustrated. How do I put this? In terms of story, I get why Superman reacts the way that he does to Wonder Woman's actions. And one of the other, I think, big compliments that I can pay this whole run of stories leading up to Infinite Crisis. I think when you get to Infinite Crisis #1 and you get to that scene that runs throughout the issue of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman on the blown out Watchtower having this heated debate, it feels earned. And
Yeah,
what I always loved about it was the tension that's between them, the philosophical divide that's between them feels real. It doesn't feel, manufactured. You get where each of them is coming from, and I always like that it wasn't a matter of, oh, Superman and Batman versus Wonder Woman, or Batman and Wonder Woman versus Superman, right? They each have a problem with each other, right? Like it's a pretty even split here, which I think is effective. But so on that level, I get why Superman reacts the way that he does, but I don't know, man. I just like it bothers me. I mean, I guess how do you feel about Wonder Woman's action and
Yeah.
in terms of executing Max Lord as well as Superman's reaction to her what she's done?
All right, so let me go back a little bit. I think you used the right word when describing Max Lord's intentions when you said that he's trying to show them. Because the reality is, yes, he's the mastermind behind this, but I think in his mind, his feeling is, if I don't do this, somebody else will. And what they're going to do is probably going to be even worse. So I want to show you the problems with this whole superhero thing, so that you can address it now. I think he thinks he's doing a service for the heroes and for the world. Um, I think that while I think the sacrifice storyline probably could have been a little less repetitive. And if you want to know just how repetitive, you look no further than the covers of each of the parts of the crossover, because I guess there was some sort of editorial mandate that the composition of the image had to be the same, with Superman sort of leaning his fist and shoulder into a bad guy. And then when we get to the Wonder Woman, it's Wonder Woman in the same position, but against Superman. So there is a similarity in terms of those compositions, with just a different villain sort of, substituted in. So I think that there could have been a little bit less repetition, but I think the lead in to where it all goes is very satisfying and very effective. Um, and I think choosing Wonder Woman as the one to ultimately put an end to this was a brilliant choice, because Wonder Woman, of all the heroes, is the one who's about love and compassion and understanding, right? I mean, she's got this saying, and I always butcher it, but I have one day I have to memorize it. It's like, don't kill if you can maim, don't maim if you can injure, don't injure if you can subdue, don't subdue if you can reach out a hand in peace, something to that effect. And to see her go so far as to snap someone's neck, I mean, and it is not done in silhouette, it is brutal. And this image by several different artists is burned into my memory. um, I think is a really important one. I think it's supposed to have the same effect, the same shock value for the readers as it does for the characters in story. That of all the people, Wonder Woman is the one to do this, but she feels completely justified in this. And again, it sparks that conversation of, when, if ever, is it okay for a hero to kill? And given the circumstances, and of course this is the context that most of the DC world doesn't have, is that conversation with Max Lord beforehand that you recap so nicely, where, you know he admits, the only way I'm ever going to stop is if I'm dead. And if a villain says that to you, I think you have to take him seriously. I think you have to take it at face value. And you can't have a character like Superman running around without his mind and his control, beating on people, thinking that it's someone else, thinking it's, as you said, Darkseid, Doomsday, Brainiac. I think Ruin was one of them
Yeah,
too in
yeah,
there, so,
Ruin.
right? So I was excited about it. I was intrigued by it, but I think it fits the tone of the DC universe at the time, coming out of Identity Crisis and realizing that heroes are sometimes called upon to make really difficult choices. The vote to mind wipe Dr. Light, the vote to mind wipe Batman in Identity Crisis is a similar kind of moment, where whatever side you fall on is not what's important. What's important is that you understand both sides of the debate, and why they made the choice that they made. I think that this also sets up those conversations in Identity Crisis, and a lot of the conversations even beyond this particular event. And for that reason, I think it was a really bold, interesting, and exciting choice. What I did not want to see from the Sacrifice crossover when I originally read it and this time is that cliched moment where somebody Superman cares about, looks him in the eye and shakes him and says, "Snap out of it, Clark, fight it, you can do it." And he sort of claws his way back mentally from the control and snaps out of it. We've seen that so many times. And there are times when it works. There are times when it works. But I think that in this particular instance, with the tone of the DC universe, with the story they were trying to tell, I thought that absolutely would have been the wrong move, would have been taking us so far backwards that it would have invalidated a lot of the Crisis event in the first place. And so I'm happy they didn't go that direction.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot, especially when we talk about the notion of heroes killing, and Superman in particular, whether it's in the context of the Man of Steel movie or the John Byrne arc when he executes the Phantom Zone criminals. And
Yep.
as I always say, it's all well and good to say that whether it's Superman, Batman, any character will never kill as long as writers provide outs for them, and there's always a way. And what I appreciate about something like Man of Steel or this story is I think you are being shown, and this is another instance with Wonder Woman, there really wasn't an out. Because you're right, it could have very easily been, and yes, as a Superman fan, I would have loved if he had been able to break through this on his own, but it's like, no, that's not what this was about. So it's like, if you're in a situation where Max has this control over the most powerful being in the universe, what would you do? And I thought Wonder Woman's actions were perfectly justified. It was interesting hearing you talk about how, she felt like a surprising choice given her background. In my mind, it's like, she's the warrior. She understands the battlefield. She understands tactics, sacrifice, strategy, all of that. So, she made a tactical decision there, not one that she relished, not one that she enjoyed, right? But she knew it had to be done. I guess what frustrated me was, again, Superman's reaction. He's appalled at what she's done. And Bruce, too, when she goes to the Batcave and explains what she did. And poor Bruce, he's got a lot going on. but Superman
Bruce should be dead at this point, too. I mean,
yes.
Superman kicked the crap out of him, and he's bandaged up, lying down, and can barely move. And then very shortly after, he's sort of up and suited up again and back in it. But
so again, I think from a story perspective, you need to have this disagreement among them. I get that. As a Superman fan, I don't know. I was a little frustrated with Superman in his reaction to this, because it's like, what would you have had her do? Right? You allowed yourself to be controlled by this metahuman and nearly killed your best friend. And this was the choice that she had to make. She made, I'm very fired up about this, because it's like Diana made that choice so that you didn't have to, right? Like, she took that on. You talk about a sacrifice. She made that sacrifice. She crossed that line for you. And the other thing too, and I get like so far afield on this, but just this idea of for Superman in particular, to killing or not. And we talked about, and just the larger idea of Superman's morality. I talked about this last time, where there have been numerous instances, especially recently, where I've realized, I guess, I'm like ascribing my morality to Superman. And so if he acts or thinks differently than me, it's like, it's jarring to me. And it's weird, because on the one hand, yes, there are certain kind of indelible principles that we know Superman follows, but at the same time, we've seen that morality change, right? You go back to those earliest Golden Age stories, he's clearly killing people.
Yeah.
And also he's the product of countless writers and artists over all of these years and across media. So everything is kind of always at least shifting slightly and a product of multiple things. So there's not always, I guess, one clear answer per se. But I guess because I've been inspired by Superman, right? But it's this weird thing where I guess if Superman and I differ on that moral question, maybe it's my arrogance, rather than saying, oh, gee, this character I love, who's inspired me, who is this ultimate hero, thinks this, maybe I need to reconsider. I more look at it from the perspective, in my arrogance perhaps, of just, this is not the right characterization for Superman, because this is not what I think. And so I recognize that. I totally recognize that. But, and the other thing too, and maybe this is my legal background, right? Like, not that the law is always correct, but right, like, there are instances where taking someone's life can be justified. So then that's the legal side. Then of course there's still religious side, just the
Yep.
ethical side generally. I know there are a lot of pieces to all of this, but the sort of this blanket, like, we'll never kill. And at the same time, to be clear, it's not like I'm saying I want him to be out killing people all of the time, but I feel like he would recognize instances where that was really the only appropriate choice, because I would recognize it. And so again, this is where I'm like glomming my morality onto him. I'm continuing to wrestle with this, but that's what I was kind of going up against in this, in reading it.
Yeah, and I think you bring up some very sort of honest and raw feelings about all this that don't often come up, and I'm so happy that to see you sort of fired up about it, because I think you're right. Like, if we get at least part of our morality from the superhero comics that we read, which I think is a perfectly valid place to have gotten morality, because more often than not, our mainstream superheroes, because they're crafted and written by writers, are generally doing the right things. They're making difficult choices in the face of circumstances, and we wish sometimes that we could make those kinds of decisions, even if they're hard, when we probably don't. But yeah, when we get our morality from them, if then those characters behave in a way that we find questionable, we have to either ask what's wrong with them or what's wrong with me. And it's far easier to say what's wrong with them, or the writer didn't write it correctly, or that's not my Superman, or it's much easier to put it off on somebody else than it is to look inside ourselves and see how we really feel about it. And that's one of the things that I tried to do in this reread with this story, because knowing that Max Lord's murder was going to come up, I really wanted to approach it as honestly as I could, and I had really no problems with Wonder Woman killing him. And I don't think that that means, as you said, it doesn't mean that I want every superhero I read to be this sort of grim and gritty Watchmen style hero who's going to, throw the villain down the elevator shaft and laugh about it afterwards. But I think that there are instances where you look and say, this person had no other choice. And I firmly believe that, but I also believe that it doesn't even matter what I think about it, because I am applying my human morality to Wonder Woman, who is, in essence, a god. And if I were a god, my sense of morality would be shaped by so many other things than my humanness, because I wouldn't be human in the traditional sense. So I think it's unfair in some ways for us to impose our morality on them, because what they're dealing with, the power that they have, and the forces that they're allayed against require a different morality than you and I will ever experience.
Yeah, yeah, no, that certainly makes sense. And again, just for the audience to be clear, like, in the context of this story, it's not, I don't have an issue with how Rucka wrote Superman, right? In this instance, I get it and it makes sense, and you need to have that tension between them. It's, yeah, it's sort of this larger thing, and really looking at these characters as if they're real. Uh, with Wonder Woman in particular, this was a great payoff to an issue of Adventures of Superman written by Rucka, which you and I read and talked about last year, and I recently brought up last week when we did Identity Crisis. It was an Identity Crisis tie-in where Superman is talking to Batman and Wonder Woman, I think at the Fortress, about how to deal with ruin.
Right.
And this is where Superman acknowledges he knows what the League had done to Dr. Light in the past. And Batman is just like, you knew, and that's kind of put off to the side. But it's more about Wonder Woman's reaction. And it was so clearly Rucka knew where he was going, right, and was planting the seeds for this, because Wonder Woman's like, you shouldn't have let, the League shouldn't have erased his memories or changed his personality. You should have killed him, right? And it's this question of, well, like, what is the lesser of two evils in terms of taking someone's mind, their memories, their personality versus their life. And especially in this instance where you think about, like, what options did she have? Max is pretty clear. If you knock me out when I wake up, I'm going to do this again. Now, yeah,
Yep.
maybe she could knock him out and get him to Martian Manhunter quickly enough to do something, but we had seen Jean's abilities were limited, right? When he was probing Clark's mind, he really could only do so much. What would the option be? Probably another magical lobotomy. So what is, when you talk about, the lesser of two evils here, again, in terms of how I look at it, I think she made the right call. And then the other thing here, and I don't mean to always bring up Man of Steel, but I remember I remember Henry Cavill giving an interview, and I don't know if it was right after Man of Steel. I feel like it was quite some time later, but he was talking about at the time, like his next solo outing as Superman. Poor guy.
Yeah.
But he had said something like he wanted to see now where Clark's story goes after the events of Man of Steel. He's like,
Yeah.
he's not going to kill again, obviously. And I remember, watching that interview, and I was like, again, maybe again imposing my morality here, but I look at Man of Steel and I think that the way the city is destroyed, right? The battle takes place in the city and it's demolished, and clearly there's a lot of casualties. That I look at as the product of, hey, this was his first day on the job. And you see in Batman v Superman, one of the first things he does when fighting Doomsday is take him to an unpopulated area. But the killing of Zod, and again, I know people feel differently and people feel strongly. It's all good, but in my mind, if Clark were, I don't think that Clark's actions in that moment were a product of him being inexperienced. I think it was a product of he was forced and he was in a situation just like Diana here, where it was either kill or let that family be killed. In my mind, if Superman, even the Superman after Zack Snyder's Justice League, if he were placed in that exact same situation again, because again, I don't think it was a matter of, oh, he didn't know the strategy, he didn't know what else to do. It's like he was faced with that choice in that exact moment. So again, I just, it's hard for me to always see it as this absolute line, but I do get it. And I do also, we've talked about this too, like when we talked about that ending battle story, that crossover in the Superman titles, that Joe Kelly was one of the creators
Hmm.
involved, and with Manchester Black. And no matter what Clark thought Manchester Black had done, he still wouldn't bring himself to kill the character. And there is something to be said for this just like totally aspirational version that is unbending, unbreakable, no matter what. There's this line that he won't cross, even though when we again view it through how we would react, or even how this character would react in a real world situation, there's something valuable, I think. I get it. I do get this kind of notion of this absolute, but it's fun to talk about, I guess.
It is, and I think it's necessary too, because I think the world has gotten more complex, and it's important to not try to see it as all this or all that, or I don't think any of these situations are black and white, and even Man of Steel, which I don't share your love and appreciation of the Snyderverse as a whole, and the only way I can really kind of accept Man of Steel it's sort of as a I'll say as valid, but no, it's valid. But the only way I can kind of come to grips with the way he behaves in that movie is to say what you mentioned before. Like, he is very early in his career, and this is a movie about failure. This is a movie about making the mistakes that anybody makes their sort of first few times out in any job or undertaking, and my what I rub up against most in that movie is the internal inconsistency of allowing the entire city to be just demolished, but what pushes them over the edge are three people,
Hmm.
you know and that's the moment. Whereas we had 40 minutes about of you know Superman and Zod throwing each other through buildings, and we get glimpses of the suffering and the injury and the death around it, and at no point during that does he say, I gotta end this now. Let me just snap this guy's neck. And it was only when three individual people, and granted, he's looking directly into their faces, like he can see the fear that they're experiencing, and part of it may have been that empathy of now it feels real, as opposed to sort of these buildings just sort of falling down, even knowing that there are people inside who are going to be suffering. It just felt like it was too little too late for me in that particular moment. But I do think it's important to have these discussions. And if what sparks them is a superhero comic or a superhero movie, then great. But I think we live in a complex world, and I think that there are circumstances where we may be called upon to make really difficult decisions like this, life or death decisions, and knowing how we would approach that, and knowing what circumstances for us might cause us to cross that line, I think is really important.
I agree, and again, even as I'm laying out what I did, I know people feel differently. So it's all, again, it's all good. Like we're saying, I think the conversation's important, so I'm grateful for this sacrifice spinoff and the OMAC project and everything because
Yeah,
it prompted these thoughts and these discussions, and I think that's great. I love working with the material like this. So
I agree.
we're getting close to 2 hours. So what I would
Okay.
like to do is maybe like a little lightning round about the other miniseries. Because I'll be honest, like I said, I don't have a ton to say about them. So let me just go through a few things quickly and then I'll toss it to you and
Yep.
share whatever you'd like about them. Day of Vengeance, it was so funny to me because I'm thinking the whole time I'm reading this, it's like, okay, the Spectre is without a host and is kind of going crazy, and the DCU is in disarray. And it's like, this is Day of Judgment. I mean, it's like, very similar, but I
Yeah.
guess it shows the consistency, right? When the Spectre is without a host, things go poorly.
I do.
Overall, I thought it was fun. Uh, it's funny because it ultimately builds our Shadow Pact group only take things so far, and then in the final issue, they're literally just watching a fight between the Wizard and Spectre, and that
Yeah.
felt a little odd to me. I mean, we had seen the Wizard throughout, so it wasn't like, oh, they just shoehorned him in at the end, right? He had been there, but I don't know, for a story about the Shadow Pact, I guess I would have wanted them to like accomplish more or do more. Not that they don't accomplish anything. And what we ultimately find out in Infinite Crisis was that uh, the Alexander Luthor, right, and Superboy Prime, they need the magic of the DC universe to fuel that tuning fork or whatever it is that's going to bring
Right.
back the multiverse. So that's kind of why they're having Spectre declare war on magic.
Yeah, I found this very entertaining. Um, I didn't have a tremendous emotional attachment to any of the characters in the Shadow Pact because I before I read this the first time I didn't know any of them, and now I have some familiarity. But even so, none of them have really been featured in any sort of major roles in the DC in the last 20 years. Um, but I found it very entertaining. I mean, you got Bill Willingham, who I didn't know at the time, but as having read Fables and all that, great writer, and uh, and Justiniano's art is just spectacular. It's just spectacular. It's a shame that he hadn't been able to do more. I know he had some legal troubles shortly after this series and hasn't been, creating comics since. But I was really drawn in by the art here. It was different. It was familiar enough, but different, and I really, really enjoyed that. I also really liked how they pulled on the thread of Jean Loring, the Adams ex-wife, having been the sort of mastermind, unwitting, I guess, mastermind in the Identity Crisis story, and then being taken over by the Eclipso persona and sort of becoming a full sort of villain, even though it's not Jean herself; she's under the influence. I wish they had done more with that, moving forward, because I don't remember that becoming really anything beyond this. But it was nice to see the tie between Identity Crisis and this build up to Infinite Crisis, um, in that way. Beyond that, yeah, I don't have too much to say, but I just enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would.
Right on. And I think the logic that Eclipso uses against Spectre, this whole idea of, well, you want order, right? And magic represents chaos. So if you eliminate magic, you'll achieve your desired goal. And in that battle with the wizard's like, if you're not doing what you think you're doing, you're not destroying magic, you're just breaking all of these bonds that have kept it in check, and magic
Right.
will run amok and all of that. So
Right.
yeah, no, like that was cool. Again, overall enjoyable. The funny thing too was that in the time since Day of Vengeance, the Arrow television show used Ragman in its fifth
Right.
season. And I remember I liked the character well enough on the show, but I remember because that season in particular, after delving into magic and supernatural in season 4, which I really did not care for, in season 5, it really got back to a much more grounded approach. Yet they had Ragman in there, and they wrote him off fairly quickly because I think they realized like this guy's too powerful. It was a weird addition to that show. The RANN-THANAGAR WAR, again, very action packed. Art was gorgeous. I love the idea of Hawkman and Hawkgirl, right? Who people on the ground, right, assume are on the side of the Thanagarians, and no, like they're actually working with Adam Strange and they're trying to bring peace. And we have the cult of the Seven Devils from Thanagar, and we bring back Onimar Sin, who was part of the Return of Hawkman story in JSA. So like that was cool. overall, I just felt like this was pretty light, like great art, great action. Uh, but I didn't feel like there was a ton of meat on the bone here. It was entertaining though, and I liked the spectacle, and I liked kind of, like I said, the outer space sci-fi feel worked more for me than I would have expected it to. So it was solid, but yeah, I didn't have a ton on that one.
I echo everything you said. I remember liking this series more the first time I read it. This time, you know, drooled over Ivan Rice art, but beyond that, I found myself moving sort of very quickly through it, even sort of speeding through some of the narration boxes just to kind of get the broad strokes of things because I didn't feel like anything super groundbreaking or connected was going to happen with regard to Infinite Crisis. So it's something I will certainly keep in my collection. I'm not getting rid of it anytime soon. It's enjoyable, but yeah, I agree. Not much meat on the bone.
With Villains United, what's so funny? Again, it's been almost 20 years. My memory of this, I thought it was really all about the society. And
Mm.
then as I'm reading, like, oh no, like there was this whole group who were resisting and they have their own thing. And yeah, it was fun. I think Gail Simone really did a great job of of playing these characters off against each other. I really liked the Catman glow up because we had seen him in Brad Meltzer's Archer's Quest, and he's the schlubby loser at this point. And then here, he's just totally reinvented himself in terms of physicality and just his whole demeanor. So I thought that was cool. Ragdoll, another character used in the Arrowverse to great effect. I thought that was always so cool.
It was so
So
creepy.
yeah, so like that was kind of the funny thing too. These characters who, when I first read these stories, I really knew nothing about, had no connection to. Now we've seen them interpreted, on screen in various places, and then to kind of go back and look at these stories, I definitely enjoyed them more because I'm like, oh, okay, like I have more of a connection to that character. It
Mm.
was also the other thing I know I mentioned we have the business with the two Lex Luthors. I don't mean
Mhm.
to nitpick. I felt the reveal of that there were two and that or the Lex in the green war suit. We got his narration for a bit. That just felt very, very tacked on, but it's fine. But Pariah, they dig up Pariah from the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Alexander Luthor kills him. But of course he comes back because I know
Of
he
course.
figures prominently into Dark Crisis, which we're getting to.
Yeah.
But I forgot that he was in this, and now reading all these Crisis things together, I'm like, oh, like that was a cool pull. And um, I know I said I reread that JSA classified arc with Power Girl. I won't get into all of that, but basically, Psycho Pirate is showing her like all of these different potential origins as he's trying to get through to her that hey, you are the last survivor of Earth 2 from the pre-crisis multiverse. And that arc ends with her getting taken by Clayface. And here in Villains United, there's this business about gathering certain representatives from the different Earths of the multiverse that was, right? Because that's what Alexander Luthor is going to use as he's trying to bring back these other Earths. So you get that bit of business. And then I guess the last key plot point is that what Alexander Luthor, posing as Lex, has convinced all of the villains is that they are building this giant device to mind wipe the heroes. Right? We'll find out in Infinite Crisis. No, it's not that. He's bringing back the multiverse, but that's how he's gotten all of them on board. It's like they did this to Dr. Light. We're going to wipe their minds, and that's kind of what the setup is. But yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed that. I guess I would say I enjoyed probably OMAC the most because it was the most relevant. And again, it's spun off into Sacrifice. Like there was more going on, and more Superman. Then probably Villains United. Then I don't know, Day of Vengeance or RANN-THANAGAR, a little bit of a toss up. But what about Villains United? Did you want to say?
Um, yeah, probably shouldn't have enjoyed it as much as I did. I mean, the characters, just for the listeners who haven't read it, the characters featured in this Secret Six sort of resistance group: Catman, Deadshot, who maybe is the most prominent of all of them, a parademon, like a
Yeah.
sort of nameless fit with parademon, Cheshire, Scandal Savage, not Vandal Savage, Scandal Savage, and Ragdoll. This is a very strange group. You'd think if you're going to do a group of villains who are standing against all of the others, there's certainly no end to the combinations you could create. But you would think that to sell the book, you'd want more prominent villains, someone's arch nemesis to be on the, but they don't go that way. And I kind of like it because, like you said earlier, like there's a little bit of a clean slate with a lot of these characters because they're so relatively underdeveloped over time, that, there are interesting pairings and relationships and arguments that take place that felt really natural, that felt like evolutions of the characters. And then you still have this enormous, basically all of the other villains of the DC universe are right against them. And I really, really enjoyed this. I more than I thought. I mean, it looked great. It was exciting. And because they were sort of D list villains, fighting against all of the other villains, I always had the sense that like anybody could die at any moment. And because you're not dealing, it's not Luthor and the Joker and Sinestro, and it's not the Legion of Doom from Super Friends, where you probably wouldn't want to kill off a major villain. The stakes were low but kind of high at the same time, and it was just sort of unpredictable, which I think for a story focused on villains is a necessary element. So I really enjoy. I didn't expect to, but I really enjoyed it.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. For anyone who hasn't read it, that's one I certainly do recommend.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was our countdown to Infinite Crisis. It was, like we've been saying, a very exciting time, especially if you were experiencing it live in the DCU, and especially if it was hitting you at the right point in your fan journey, like it did for us. And I appreciate you rereading all of that material and having this discussion. And I'm glad it seems like you enjoyed what you read, as did I. And yeah, I mean, next up we're getting into Infinite Crisis. It's I'm excited to finally get back there.
Me too, particularly because several years ago we talked about it on the Comic Shop Book Club podcast. So I'm curious to see what you and your guest have in store for that, especially because for you it's a reread, but a fairly recent reread, because it wasn't that long ago that we tackled it. So I'm really excited to hear it.
Yeah, but this is the first time I'm rereading it after all of the prelude
Right.
material. So
Right.
yeah, it'll be every time we do this, there's always some little different different way to attack it. So again, I thank you very much, and I look forward to having you back in 2 weeks for 52.
I am so excited to read the series and to revisit it with you, particularly because I know you haven't read it before. So this could crash and burn and you could hate it. I don't know, but I doubt it, given the creators involved and given where the story is going. And I think you'll appreciate it because you're reading this sequence of crisis events, and it has a really important place bridging gaps from one crisis to the next crisis. So yeah, I'm super excited.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So I thank you, Scott. I thank you, audience. Everyone, pour one out for Ted Kord. Although, don't get too upset. He comes back later. So
yeah.
This poor guy, his voice cracks when he's talking to Superman, and he's like Superman was kind enough not to notice. Again, the humanity. I love that about that issue, and and about this period of time in general. I think it really showed these characters as people. And I do appreciate that. So, all right. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, audience. We will be back in 1 week with Chapter 6 of Red Skies, Infinite Crisis. Don't miss it. As always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.